Hello everyone. In this video we are going to discuss about Judith Wright. She is a noted Australian poet, environment activist, a critic, short story writer, and most of all a fervent campaigner for the land rights of the Aborigines or the Aboriginal people. We are going to discuss a very interesting poem of Wright which is titled Dust. Now before we move on to the poem, let's quickly discuss about Judith Wright as a poet, how she is recognized in the field of literature and environment. Aboriginal people is a term used to describe the indigenous people of a territory or the inhabitants of a land who have existed there from the earliest of times before the foreign colonizers came and settled there. So there could be Indian Aborigines or Native Americans or even Australian Aboriginal people for whose rights Judith Wright fought throughout her active life. Now, in the early days of Australian civilization, these Aboriginal people were spread throughout the country. They had their own flag and their own symbolism in which they connected with all the natural elements such as the sun and the land, and that is what Judith Wright writes about in her poetry. There are several myths and folklore attached with these Aboriginal people, such as dreaming or dream time, in which they believe that their ancestors created the earth, the land, and they created all the geographical elements such as rivers, lands, hills, plants, and animals. So, Judith Wright is known for her perceptive thrust on issues concerning the Australian environment. The relationship between the settlers, the aborigines, and the natural surroundings are some of the major work themes of the poet. The core belief of her poetry rests on the interdependence between human beings and the environment. She has been known for her active role in preservation of the Great Barrier Reef, which is located in the Coral Sea in Australia, and also of the Fraser Island. So basically, in sum, her poetry showcases the connection between the human and the natural world. She uses her poetry as a means to generate awareness among people regarding their responsibility towards the natural flora and fauna. Her poetry also falls within the broad category of eco poetry, where she equates herself with the land and natural surroundings and also protests against the exploitation of nature through her evocative poems. Now, as we move to a description of this particular poem, we find that it is about something very commonplace, dust. And dust itself is a natural element, a sort of dirt made up of different minute particles. And in the context of the poem, as it is used, it also includes some precious elements, such as the soil, which is wasted away during the excessively burdensome intervention of the modern industrial civilization and the modernized technological ways of farming. So the poem uses dust as a symbol of the destructive times which lie ahead of mankind and how the deleterious activities of humans will ultimately open up ways for their own destruction. The first stanza begins as this sick dust spiraling in the wind is harsh as grief's taste in our mouths and has eclipsed the small sun. The remnant earth turns evil, the steel shocked earth has turned against the plow and runs with wind all day and all night, sighs in our sleep against the window pane. So, this is the first stanza of the poem, and now, right from the first stanza, it becomes clear that the speaker is talking about the barren land and the spiraling dust, which implies that dust has become so wild that it has almost assumed huge proportion and is going to rampage all the natural surroundings. It is so harsh that it makes human beings grieve, and its might is such that it has diminished the sun too. Not just that, but even the earth, which used to feed men, has suddenly turned evil, and this is because it is steel shocked, implying that the modern farming practices with heavy machinery and steel and iron and such elements on a regular basis has hardened the soul of the earth, as it were, and in retaliation, it has turned against the plow that tills the land. And this means that the soil has become weak and it flows away with the wind in the form of dust, and human beings can do nothing but sigh at this violent turn of nature. Now, you have to remember that Judith Wright wrote this poem during a difficult time, and it was the time of the Second World War and a time of drought and summer during the 1942 and 1943. So, then was this poem written. And so, it is a poem about the land turning dry and infertile, and also there is a reference to a sort of dust bowl. Now, what is a dust bowl? Dust bowl is a term that was originally used to refer to a period of severe dust storms, particularly in the drought stricken prairie regions of the United States and Canada during the 1930s. It destroyed the ecology of the regions affected, and virtually no farming was possible for quite a while, and even people were forced to keep locked in their homes to avoid harm. This can be related to our own age when we are locked down for a different kind of neglect of the environmental markers. Now, why this happened basically was due to the unsustainable farming practices that intensified drought and killed many crops that kept the soil bound to them. And so, when winds blew, they raised huge whirlwinds of dust as if a hurricane had come. So, this dust suffocated animals and caused pneumonia in children and made the era of Great Depression even more tougher for United States to deal with. Now, with the next stanza, we read, "Wind was kinder once, carrying cloud like a water bag on his shoulder. Sun was kinder, hardening the good wheat brown as a strong man. Earth was kinder, suffering fire and plow, breeding the unaccustomed harvest." So every natural element was kinder earlier. A little while earlier, everyone was at peace. Leaning in our doorway together, watching the bird cloud shadows, the fleet wing winds, shadows travel our clean wheat, we thought ourselves rich already. We counted the beautiful money and gave it in our hearts to the child asleep, who must never break his body against the plough and the stubborn rock and tree. So, this is the image, the happy image in the second stanza, where the speaker says that the wind was not always this wild and natural elements are usually very pretty and peaceful and sustaining. Sun made crops strong and bound the soil to them, and earth, even the earth suffered some farming activities. So, even though it was not open to all those even traditional methods of farming, but still it suffered somehow and still it sustained us. Wind used to blow softly through all the plantation and everything was beautiful. People did so well that they did not need to fret about their children having to work hard and farming the land, very intensely, plowing as they did. So they were not worried about anything. They had hopes of a secure and beautiful future. This is what the second stanza says. But the third stanza then comes, "But the wind rises, but the earth rises, running like an evil river. But the sun grows small, and when we turn to each other, our eyes are dust, and our words are dust. Dust has overtaken our dreams that were wider and richer than wheat under the sun, and war's eroding gale scatters our sons with a million other grains of dust." So man's greed and blatant unconcern brought them to such a state that they rose up in reaction, and the wind rises, and soon every other element rises, and soon the dust was everywhere. The dust was on houses, on the objects, on the window panes, even in our eyes and words. So this is a very suffocating but a realistic image. And all their dreams and hopes have been covered by dust, even literally, as the people could not go anywhere. They could do anything but step out of the home. They could not go out because of these dust storms, as you are visualizing on the screen. And just as this all this was happening, there was another kind of thing happening in the human society, which was the Second World War, and it was eroding the young men, the young sons of these men. It was killing the young soldiers, just as the wind erodes the fertile soil with dust. So it means man was always bothered about his greed. Man was always bothered about acquiring more and more land, defeating nations through its rising might. Nations were fighting amongst themselves during the Second World War, while the natural surroundings were suffering these dust bowls and all other natural calamities which keep on happening from time to time. But nobody was bothered about that. And then the final stanza comes, where the poet writes, "O sighing at the blistered door, darkening the evening star, the dust accuses." So now the dust has become accusative. It accuses the people. "Our dream was the wrong dream. Our strength was the wrong strength." This is a realization, a moment of realization in the poem for the speaker. "Weary as we are, we must make a new choice, a choice more difficult than resignation, more urgent than our desire of rest at the end of the day. We must prepare the land for a difficult sowing, a long and hazardous growth of a strange bread. that our sons may harvest and be fed. So now there are two types of realizations in the final stanza. First is that our dream was the wrong dream. We were thinking it all wrong. We were not believing the signals that the earth was repeatedly giving us. So, in the final stanza, the dust has become everyday reality. It accuses, it claims that human beings were being too much with the earth, and all their dreams of continuing reaping the benefits with modern, effortless methods of farming were all unfair to the earth. Therefore, it is better to make a difficult choice and survive rather than an easy one and suffocate. They must make the land ready again for sowing, which will be a tougher task than earlier, and they must grow their food through labor and pain so that their children can be fed. So basically, this is a symbolic poem where a metaphorical connection has been made between the loss of the topsoil from the steel shocked or ploughed land in the drought and the dying of the young men on the battlefield. Shell shocked is a term that was used during the World War I to refer to soldiers on the battlefield who suffered a mental trauma from the excess exposure to sounds and atmosphere of rattling guns, bullets, and firing, and later on experienced symptoms such as inconsolable crying and shivering and such. Similarly, the earth in the poem has had enough exposure to the heavy steel machinery of the modern farming equipment such as the tractors, combines, mowers, balers, automatic harvesters, and weeders and such. So basically, in treating the earth as just a resource which is there to support humans, we tend to look at everything from the human centered perspective or a human centric perspective, and thus tend to often disregard all concerns of the natural environment, which is why nature retaliates in the form of these dust bowls and other natural phenomena. This is why the dust runs like an evil river by the end of the poem, in place of the rivers and water bodies that are very nourishing and that provide water for the growth of all our food requirements. Though the realization comes late in the poem, there is still hope for them to make a new start. And so the poem is an appeal to the readers to give up their usual thinking tendencies which cause them to see the earth and all of the nature as subordinate to human beings, and rather it asks us to develop a new way of thinking which is more considerate of all life on earth, and not just humans but every other animal and plant species, and develops a more deeper relation with the land. Only then can we hope to achieve a better future for humanity. You must be realizing how current this poem is in its essence to our present condition when we are trapped in a pandemic simply for our own disregard of nature and its various organisms and species that are there, and the lack of having a kindly relationship with them. This is what the poem wishes to convey, and from an ecocritical view of the entire condition, it is a very, very impactful poem. Thank you for listening.